Welcome to a place in time where the spirit of conversation is held differently. Welcome to Voicecraft. My name is Tim Adeline, and in a moment we're about to drop into a dialogue with Layman Pascal, Cadell Last, Sean Kelly and Simon van der Els. They'll be meeting the question, is the Earth enough? This episode marks a new format for Voicecraft, where voices are invited to engage a pre-recorded question or prompt and shape it their own way. There's no ordinary role of host to speak of. Instead, the stage is set in time to invite a compelling unfolding. There will often be a network member asked to take on the role of light guidance in the opening and closing of space as an additional responsibility. But otherwise, the intention is for the spirit of conversation we seek to strengthen at Voicecraft to call in that authorship and responsibility from the group. In this case, we have two Voicecraft members in participation, Cadell and Simon, with Simon taking on the extra role. Introducing then our invited voices, about whom you can read more in the description and show notes. Layman Pascal is well known in integral and metamodern networks as the host of the Integral Stage podcast, author of Gurdjieff for A Time Between Worlds, insightful general thinker and spiritual teacher, and it's an honor to have him return to Voicecraft again. Cadell Last is a philosopher and author of the works Systems and Subjects, as well as Global Brain Singularity, with the subtitle Universal History, Future Evolution, and Humanity's Dialectical Horizon, among other works. He's also the founder of Philosophy Portal, teaching courses on great works, great thinkers, and critical concepts in a unique intellectual community, with one starting on October 20 on the concept of Christian atheism. Sean Kelly is a professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and the author of Coming Home, as well as Becoming Gaia on the Threshold of Planetary Initiation, which draws on big history, comparative religion, transpersonal psychology, and integral philosophies. Simon van der Els holds a PhD in molecular microbiology and explores the subjective realm of shamanism as a way of rediscovering the interiority of the living cosmos. After the prompt that follows, the same prompt the guests received, the first voice you hear will be that of Simon. May the dialogue that follows, held in the Voicecraft spirit, call you into contemplation. Is the Earth enough? And are we worthy of the Earth? It might plausibly be said that we're struggling as a species to make it past the Great Filter. The one where some so-called intelligent civilization fails to live beyond its discovery of the capacity to destroy itself, or at least long enough to become known to other intelligences elsewhere in the universe. Where, as the story might go, for reasons of biosphere destruction or tech-enabled self-annihilation, the story of humanity, and perhaps even life on Earth, might come to its end by the hand of its own creation, by the hand of its own children. Yet the very frame given here is one of progress, attainment of the next thing, and making it past some barrier or a going someplace other, that the Earth is not enough, that here we are, lacking, reaching, and overreaching in reacting to that lack. In other words, we often act as though we want more, to cultivate habitat or find value in other worlds, whether in outer space, other lands, or perhaps in fantasy. Yet it may also be asked, have we managed as a species to appreciate the Earth we actually live on? Many have commented on our tendency toward exploitation and failure to include the relational value of the ecosystems we inhabit in our reductions of value to financial notation. The value of a tree is measured, say, in terms of its lumber value, and not in terms of the ecological role it plays. In so reducing the dynamics of relational and ecological process, it might be said we fail to understand the currents we swim in, fail to value the greater questions of our influence in the world we're a part of, and perform a very deep and fatal contradiction. Implied in this opening are key themes and questions of identity, of evolution, of essence, of spirit, of religion, of overcoming, of geopolitics, existential risk, and civilization. There is also here a key question of the very meaning of the Earth in terms of its historical, present, and future relevance for its role in a binding with humanity. Is there within our nature a drive toward an unbinding from the Earth? And what role does the Earth have in a story or cultural process that might bind us? Some process that could ward against our self-annihilating tendencies, so that our relationship with the life world may still open the potential for choice, value, life, sacredness, rather than the mind capture of self-perpetuating, self-perpetuated, self-harm. Is the Earth enough? And are we worthy of the Earth?
So feeling into the question, is the Earth enough? And are we worthy of it? And for me, immediately comes up, is the Earth enough for what? For what should the Earth be enough? And then in the second question is the we. How do we articulate the we? Is it we as a sort of wayward child of Gaia, so the Homo sapiens? But we run a risk of calling that a sort of monolithic we, as how our species behaves, being one big thing, or that we all are all in agreement. And then I think, like, is the Earth enough? And then the what? Is it enough for certain drives that exist within the Earth's biosphere, within the Earth system, us being an expression of that, so the Homo sapiens? And then I'm thinking, what are these drives then? So this drive for progress, this technological drive, well, it's part, I would like to argue, or that's maybe a question even, is that part of the biosphere itself, this reaching? Is this driving, this reaching force, is that part of the biosphere? And are we as a species, a maybe super organismal sized species, an expression of that? And is the expression on a super organismal scale, is that worthy of the planet? Or is for that the planet enough? And I don't know if that's enough. And so I think I wanted to start there with opening up the field towards how we articulate the we here, and maybe even how we articulate the Earth.
Beautiful, Simon. That certainly resonates with all of the questions I was posing. So maybe it's maybe Tim's intuition was on and getting us together here to consider this prompt.
Yeah, when I looked at those questions, I sort of had a complicated no to each one of them, but the background frame for me, the for what of it, seems to be based in the mythology that my subconscious holds about the system. Right? I have a kind of imaginal view of the biosphere as something that we can't necessarily say it's an entity, but it's useful for us to think it as an entity. I think it as something which probably has many other versions of itself throughout the universe, that this isn't just a completely unique phenomenon. It could be, but it seems likely to me that many solar spheres have biospheres within them, and many biospheres have complex sets of sentient creatures out of which maybe some sapient species emerges that fulfills some role within that biosphere, and that all of these biospheres have both an inherited self-regulatory function and a self-evolving, self-transforming function of some kind, and that the tension isn't really between do we accept it as enough and be worthy of the one we've inherited versus moving forward with all of the positive and negative metaphorical stuff that's implied in the notion of progress. But it's really about, can we do a good, constructive, graceful, intelligent job of preserving it and changing it versus doing a haphazard, unintelligent job of preserving it and changing it at the same time. Because I think it has both of those drives in itself, and it has those drives particularly as expressed through us and as expressed through the new kinds of technology we're bringing into it, which it might be bringing forth for some transformative upgrade or shift in its personal self-regulation. So that's sort of where I start on this.
Hmm.
I mean, I'll just jump in very quickly and say that whenever this question is posed, or we start thinking in this direction, I think a lot of the popular discussion about it and a lot of the popular consciousness around it is basically about the speculative mystery about the limits of human presence on the Earth. Are we reaching some sort of limit? What are the limits of the Earth in terms of its capacity to host a superorganism which seems to be unparalleled, unprecedented in terms of its appearance on the surface of the Earth? We have no parallels. We can't look back in Earth history and see another superorganism that is expressing itself in the way that the human being expresses itself. So immediately there's a mystery there. And the mystery perhaps intensifies precisely because the drive of the superorganism seems in itself inexhaustible. It in principle could keep going forever, just depending on whether the host, in this situation, the Earth, is somehow reaching some limit because of that drive. And then, of course, you get fantasies that come from this tension, which usually express themselves on the level of what I more and more consider to be colonial space fantasies, of expanding. I mean, this is very active. In the 1960s, it might have been fantasies of the United States or some United State organization going to Mars. Now it's always expressed as a corporate endeavor, where you'd have a figure like Elon Musk trying to get to Mars and presumably building some sort of colony. The question here, then, I'll just close by saying, I find very interesting to think about the dialectic between our presupposition of what the current limit of the planet are, or the current limits of the planet, versus the potential of growth of limits. And so what we think the limits are now versus the potential growth of those limits. And I think that the growth of those limits can be conceived of in physical and technological terms, in the sense that the capacities, the carrying capacity of the planet has in many ways been dramatically expanded because of the agricultural revolutions and the industrial revolutions that we've seen in human civilization in the last century or so.
Very resonant thoughts on my part. Initially, the first thought was, well, again, for whom? Enough for whom? And clearly, if the who is industrial growth society, late stage capitalism, then clearly it's not enough. I mean, that system is running way beyond the Earth's capacity to regenerate the matter and sources of energy upon which it relies. So it's clearly not enough for that. And I'm one of those who foresee the inevitable and increasingly imminent collapse of that system. It's already, of course, collapsed in several places, and is collapsing as we speak. But in terms of a generalized collapse, that to me seems inevitable, short of a miracle, whether it's the ever-receding miracle of fusion technology, or the final and absolute disclosure of our intragalactic or intergalactic neighbors, the whole UAP phenomenon, which is quite the rage now in many circles, which maybe we can return to, because that's clearly, to my mind, a manifestation of a conviction that Earth is not enough, insofar as one's gaze is focused on the other, who is coming to us with superior technology, superior means, and some kind of mysterious intent. So yeah, not enough for industrial growth society. If the WHO is a traditional representative of one of the axial religions, the world religions, particularly in their dominant exoteric forms, one could say that no, clearly Earth is not enough. If by Earth, and here we get to the question, what do we mean by Earth? If Earth is nothing but the physical systems as studied by Earth system science, including the physical, the biological, and so on, then clearly Earth is not enough, since all of these traditions conceive of other subtler realms, whether it's the heaven or the Pure Land, or various subtle realms that which the human can and is called to inhabit in some sense. So for the traditional exoteric axial religion, it's not enough. But and so that led me to the question, well, what do we mean by Earth then? Is Earth only, is it just that which is studied by Earth system sciences, one, or is it that which is at the other than human, or as some people like to say, the more than human? I don't like that phrase personally. I'm fine with other than human. But if Earth is merely the other than human, then clearly it's not enough for humans because they're excluded from that. But if Earth is the whole Earth community, which includes the human, and as you've all expressed, that the human is an intrinsic, inherent expression of Earth's nature, then that leads me to the question of what do we mean by enough in that context? And I'll end with this. I have more thoughts, but I'd like to hear more from you. Maybe enough, another way of thinking of enough is satisfied. Like, have I eaten enough? Is my hunger satisfied, let's say? Have I accomplished enough in my life? So in terms of a longing, a lure, or a telos, if we think of Earth as including us, and then we ask, well, what might Earth's deepest longing have been until now? Or what is Earth's longing, deepest longing, or telos? Has it achieved it? Has the mission been accomplished or not? I have some thoughts about that, but I'll just throw that out for now.
Yeah, lovely. I have sort of two biological metaphors that are sort of competing in my head, or images of them coming up. It's again, is the Earth enough for what? And then it also can be, is the Earth enough for what process? So is the human, so if the human is an organ within the planetary body, which I believe it is, so that every species is a specific organ function within this larger system, then okay, what kind of organ is the human? Then also, what is the process that this organ is currently doing? Mm. And if we look at it from I try to look at it from a perspective of what if there is no mistake currently? What if it isn't a overshoot process of let's say yeast in a contained cylinder in the lab, and then it just ruins it overshoots its environment and has no way of replenishing, because the planet is a self-replenishing organism, or not self-replenishing, it's being replenished by the energy of the sun and potentially other energies coming in, I don't know. Then I'm struck with the idea of like, okay, this reaching is happening, obviously, this reaching into space, the allure of space, and also this technological reaching with the advent of artificial intelligence. I think that is a sort of high expression of reaching. And then the biological metaphor that comes up for me is like, okay, can it reach out this far without tending to the roots? So can this tree grow this far into space without tending to the roots, the substrate it is grounded in? And there, I think we can be in agreement that currently it looks like we're overreaching. But I don't know. Are we overreaching? That's the thing. Are we, if I take the we to be broader, as to include the non-human community, as say the totality of the Earth system, is it overreaching, or what is it reaching for? But maybe that's difficult to answer. But these were some thoughts that were coming up for me as you were speaking, Sean.
Simon, can I ask you a question? Do you feel that the other than human can be overreaching at this stage? Like for instance, just like wild mammals on Earth now constitute something less than, I don't know, 2% of biomass, and like 97% is cattle, pigs, chickens, cats and dogs, and humans, right? So in what sense would the other than human be overreaching?
Yeah. No, that's a good distinction to make. No, I think what I meant with that is taking the totality of the biosphere and seeing it as one body. And potentially the human body, the human organ, is maybe acting cancerous in the sense that it doesn't consider the biosphere as self. So it's seeing it as environment, and it's overgrowing, let's say, its space. But I think if I try to zoom out and see then the perspective of the totality of the planet, then is the planet itself overreaching? That's what I'm trying to think.
Okay, thank you.
That notion of overreaching is a really interesting one because, the other than human doesn't seem like it's overreaching relative to the anthroposocial technical domain at the moment. But we can also see that in some ways each species in its local pocket might attempt to overreach as much as it can until it's checked by other species also trying to overreach. So the self-regulatory function of the other than human may be a way of mutually constraining the inbuilt, inexhaustible overreach of these systems. I think late-stage capitalism has something similar, which is it runs on an engine of an endlessness. It will never be enough, and that will either destroy it or it will change the type of endlessness, of never-enoughness that it's moving toward, right? We could, in theory, by certain kinds of changes in our ethos and how we make metrics out of things, shift toward a more qualitative rather than a more quantitative kind of inexhaustible search for what's never enough. But I think of enough as sort of very similar to the way I think about the biosphere, which I am distinguishing from the planet, because I think the biosphere has a terrestrial and a supraterrestrial urge at the same time. And I think the notion of satisfaction is the same way. Have I had enough to eat? Yes, for now, right? At one scale, it's satisfying. At another scale, it's unsatisfying. And those are deeply complementary with each other. I certainly intuitively and imaginally, I agree with Simon. I think of us as being an organ in a body with a task to perform. And the same part of me that resonates with those ideas also is inclined to think we're not performing that function perfectly. Right. Now, there may be ways to read this and go, we're actually doing a great job, but we know medically that organs can be failed or immature or toxified or dysregulated relative to other organs all the time. So I think we can and probably should undertake an ethos of trying to become worthy of the earth. And this involves trying to figure out and perform our organ function in that system, which to me looks like it has two broad aspects. One is the production of a noosphere that works for the biosphere, and the other one is a subtler, more imaginal, etheric, energetic function, the ancient shamanic function of what do we do with our interiors to participate in the great interiority of the other than human, which is and is not us at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So what might the function be then of the human within the planetary whole, right? So because without a clear sense of that, then it seems that we might not be able to ascertain whether or not enough in the sense of telos or purpose is or has been achieved?
I guess for me, the way I have come to think about these things, and it could just be my bias, but I always think about the human organism from the perspective of the human organism as opposed to the perspective of the earth. When we think about the human from the perspective of the earth, we can easily come up with metaphors of that we're cancerous of some kind, that we're some sort of disease of some kind. I personally don't like that metaphor. I want to understand the human on its own terms from within the human. The earth is necessary for humans to exist. In many ways, it's a contingent backdrop, however. We could have appeared on a different planet. I'm not sure what other types of universes are possible. We find ourselves appearing where we find ourselves appearing. In reference to the not enoughness, specifically that Sean was pointing towards with the axial religions, the main fantasies that I've studied in my history are the Christian and the Marxist fantasies. So you have, for example, and these are just the fantasies that I've paid attention to, but there are many other fantasies. But you have, for example, the kingdom of heaven on earth, and you have the idea of Marxist communism. Now, I'm taking both of those ideas in their positivity, what they're trying to express as fantasy. Neither of them are fantasies of late stage capitalism. Neither of them are necessarily techno-focused inherently. They probably share a social communal dimension to them. They're social centric, and they're human soul centric. They're human spirit centric. And then the question comes, what would those spaces be like? Of course, neither of them have been achieved, neither through universalizing Christianity nor through some sort of communist project that could overcome capitalism. So both of them have failed as visions. We could debate whether those visions would be good visions to actualize, whether those are possible visions, or whether they're inherently misguided visions. In regards to the question of this endlessness that Layman brings up, which I think is a very important point, of course, it shifts in both of these fantasies in the sense that it's not the endless accumulation of capital for capital's sake. It seems to be, at least in the Marxist variation, Marx would say something like it's like an endless creativity. It's an endless self-expression. It's an endless either cognitive or spiritual growth or some sort of social expansion. I'm not sure, again, if that fantasy makes sense, because when you really look into the literature, it's hard to find. There's jokes in Marxist circles of like you're finding explanations of like what actually existing communism would look like, right? It's like it's devastatingly hard to find any descriptions of that. Now those fantasies, I know that there's sort of a Christian revival, there's an intellectual revival and interest in Christianity. I'm not sure if that is pointing towards a symptom of the way capitalism has destroyed families and communities, and people are looking for some way to reclaim sovereignty in those dimensions. I think it's quite likely that that's the case. But the most popular neoliberal fantasies that are coming out of late stage capitalism are often transhuman fantasies. They're fantasies of leaving biology. They're fantasies of uploading. They're fantasies of permanent screen being. And this is something that Gen Z kids talk about all the time. Gen Z kids talk about all the time the permanent screen being permanently fixed onto a screen. So Gen Z kids don't even, forget nature. In some way, forget Earth. Like that, we're just fixated on the screen now, right? Which is a weird existence to think about, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about these types of things. Is that what would satiate or I don't know if contains the right word, what would constrain in a good direction this drive of the human superorganism, which I think in itself is kind of what we are. So like if you were to take away this drive, I mean, you would in some sense be taking away the human itself. I think the challenge is we have to accept the drive of the human superorganism and learn to channel it or direct it in a way that is towards our highest social and creative natures. I do want to say one more thing very quickly, that I think that the fantasy of biological humans going into space, I think, is a deeply unscientific idea. Because I think it's anti-Darwinian in a sense, because Darwin's entire idea of natural selection is that the organism is always adapted to its environment. And the human biology, that our biological systems are in no ways adapted to space or other planets. So any transformation of the human being into space, I would assume, would require either just a purely technological expansion, which is like biological humans aren't very often in space, but our machines are, our satellites are everywhere now, or I mean, they're expanding throughout the solar system. So in that sense, I would see spatial expansion if that is the direction that life tends. I think it's the question of what is the telos of life on the highest order. If it is expansion, I don't know if it is expansion, but if it is expansion, I would presume it would involve some sort of fundamental evolutionary transformation.
Well, of course, I don't know, but my intuition is that the destiny is not physical expansion, which I think is, I'm fairly confident that it's, sure, we might be able to get probes or something to eventually leave fully leave the solar system and perhaps, gradually approach one of the nearest stars. But in terms of human flourishing outside of the Earth system, I think it's a pipe dream. But that doesn't mean that there are not other. So if the human is among other things, an emergent property of physical biological systems, then as I think more than one of us have said earlier, it's quite likely that our galaxy and the billions of other galaxies are chock full of humans, right? Humans is just something that happens to cosmos at a certain point. And if you believe in any sort of non-local connection, psychic or spiritual, whether or not it's thought of in terms of rebirth, then it's not necessarily a question of expansion, but of a distributed evolutionary potential throughout the cosmos, so that Earth will die. Earth is finite. Whether or not it's whether or not it has to wait until the sun expands and engulfs us in a couple of billion years, or whether it's through a massive cometary impact or any other means, Earth is finite, just as this body is finite. And on the analogy of this body, which could, goddess forbid, die during this call, but it could happen. My father died like that at age 40. So, but I'm increasingly aware that this body, I'm increasingly aware of the finitude of this body, and trying to prepare for its inevitable demise. And so the question arises, have I done enough? Have I accomplished not only what I would like to accomplish, but or another way of looking at it, looking back at the life and imagining the moment of death, that transition point where the whole life is present. And you have a choice, as Nietzsche says, you either sort of contract and curse, or you affirm and bless. And that blessing includes, things like forgiveness. It includes letting go of all sense of failure and so on. And, is it possible that is what the goal is to somehow be able to enter into that heart-mind space of blessing and of unconditional affirmation? And if so, do we need to wait until the transition of death to have that, and if not, if we can somehow live out of that in this life, what would it look like? And this is a question I ask myself: what would that already achieved blessedness look like here and now? And it seems to me that one of the ways it would look like would be justice. Okay, it would be if it doesn't look like justice, then or if it doesn't look like forgiveness or compassion or beauty, these things in the here and now, then it's, I don't know what it would look like. So I'm saying a lot of things, but maybe that's enough for now.
Yeah, that's hitting a lot of points of the kind of thoughts that I also have about this, also with what Cadell brought in about sort of the human ideological or religious projects, which are very human-centric, and then transhumanism as being really a big example, or I would say a sort of until now, ultimate expression of a sort of human-centric type of thought. And then what Sean brings in is this idea of rebirth and this non-locality across the cosmos, and maybe this also, the existence of reincarnation, seeing this as, let's say, our ride here as a human individual cell, or being an individual cell in the human organ, as not being the last stop. Then transhumanism is, I think, a big denial of any kind of that, or any way of that kind of thinking. And I'm always curious to think about, does an organ know it's part of a body? Does an organ orient itself as being part of a larger organism, or does the liver treat everything outside of it as its environment? Or does it have a sense of self, of knowing, like, oh, I'm dependent on this thing? How is it being kept in check? And there are obviously, like, biological ways it's there's this ecological interaction there. But that makes me curious, like, what does the human as a species look like if it is at the same time aware it is more than just an individual, that it's a community, that it's a species, and that it's a potential organ within a larger organism, a planetary organism, which is again an organism in a cosmological organism. And are these scales of consciousness that the human can be partially aware of? And is that a step that creates this sense of enoughness? Or does that inherently create this sense of belonging or feeling at home? If I think about that, then it might be very wishful thinking, but sometimes I permit myself to do some wishful thinking, as the future sometimes looks bleak. It's like, are these growing pains of an organism that's learning to become, let's say, incorporated, yes, in the flesh again of the planet? Is this like a stage of development that is there? And of course, we cannot know, but these are some of my thoughts. And I also like what Layman was talking about. I'm deeply interested in, or these kind of concepts demand, I think, a exploration of the interior, and an exploration of the interior of the human, which is a sort of, I would say, a doorway or a tuning fork into the interior of the whole cosmos. And well, is there enough in the whole cosmos for us? That's then the question, I think. Yeah.
Beautiful.
I really relate to Sean's interest in the unconditional affirmation and blessing, and where is it that we can get to that would make all of this worth it, that would make our life worth it. But I think we have options socially about how we frame that, and that the sort of axial age framing has put that at the opposite end of the material and the biological and the finite. And I think that might be sort of a problematic way to go at this, and that the transcendent, the transpersonal, the subtle, the non-dual, all of these options that we put under these terms can be perceived as a deeper and intrinsic part of the biological and the ecological rather than as an alternative to it. So I tend to lean in that direction. I sort of feel like as we were talking, I started to think of the term metabiosphere. Like I'm imagining it upgrading through us and through our tools into something that is going to anchor down more deeply into the terrestrial earth and also flower as an organism and start putting off biospheres into space. That we are not the agents, we're more like the organ and the agent. At least this is a good story for the human superorganism to tell itself. That it's not us that goes into space. Biospheres go into space with a sort of qualitative organizational arrangement that we think of as typical of living systems. But it's also not us that goes through the screen into the technological virtual world. It's somehow life itself that recognizes itself and passes through and takes into itself these new tools and all the seemingly non-human strangeness that these tools present. I'm not very emotionally sympathetic to transhumanism or to the attitude that I see exhibited by colonialist spacefaring types of people. But I think those projects and what they discover about reality opens up pathways for the ecological to then enter and absorb and transmute itself through. And that transmutation will have one aspect that looks like encountering strange new territories and populating it, and another aspect that looks like rooting down and becoming a more organized part of what we've already accomplished. And what we see right now on the world is a kind of interference or turbulence between those two functions getting in each other's way as the cellular bifurcation begins to occur.
Layman, can I ask you, are you saying that you're imagining the likelihood of terraforming planets within or moons within the solar system?
I think that's absolutely part of it. I think the technological expansion of the biosphere to other planets and to free-floating space colonies, that's one aspect there, but it's a multi-dimensional biosphere, so it has more ramifications than just the technological.
Right.
But I don't see why it wouldn't do that when it does that here as well. It's sort of intrinsic to its nature, I think.
Okay. Well, I love that fantasy, and I read in that area and enjoy it. But sadly, my sense is that unless we succeed in terraforming or re-terraforming Earth, I really can't imagine that the technological infrastructure necessary for terraforming other celestial bodies will come about. So it's I agree that it's a theoretical potential and there's a drive for it. But I'm imagining even if it succeeded, even if Musk's dream of terraforming Mars, let's say, succeeded, okay, Mars would become one of these biospheres and humans would populate it. Wouldn't that just sort of push the question, delay the question about what is enough and what is the goal?
Two parts to that in my response. One is, yes, completely. It can't be done elsewhere if it can't be done here. To me, it's one set of understanding, right? The ability of biospheres, such as this biosphere, to realize how to regenerate and stabilize and also perhaps refine multidimensionally itself, that's one body of understanding, one body of capacity. So the ability to get better at doing it here and the ability to get better at doing it anywhere, to me, that's one thing. And I think there is an endlessness to it, right? That it's about converting more and more of the cosmos into particular types of patterning structures that we think of as naturalistic here. We might have different languages for it in other places, but we're trying to set up these spaces where deeper and more transcendental functions can occur in perpetuity throughout more and more of the system. It seems to me that biospheres lean in that direction, but obviously this is a kind of a myth making that I'm doing because I think it's useful or would be useful for humans to take on more stories of this kind.
Okay, let me just say one more thing on this thing. I don't want to monopolize, but I love that vision, and it used to be my growing up, it was part of my vision, Star Trek, a united federation of planets and so on. Um, but now my sense is that even if we could do that in our solar system, these colonies, and they uh, would be colonies. They'd be satellites of the Earth system. So it'd still be the Earth system, but with just some colonies. I really can't imagine, even if there is a terraformable, let alone Earth-like planet in Alpha Proxima, the nearest star system. I just can't conceive. I mean, I can theoretically conceive of it, but my sense is that I just can't really realistically imagine that humans will ever reach even the nearest potentially habitable planet, which means that the human project is confined to Earth and its nearby colonies. And if that's the case, then we're back to the same question. Is Earth enough, even if you include its colonies? And what is enough? What would be enough? So.
Yeah. I would imagine, I want to go to Simon here, but to me, I would think most of them are not going to be planetary, these biospheres. Most of them will
Oh,
be like technological constructs
I see.
that either move or orbit. But I think we haven't even begun to see what the possibilities of that are. We're at a very early phase of like watching the first fish try to waddle onto the land. The next immediate phase is not going to present us with really amazing unfoldings of this.
Mm.
But sorry, Simon.
Yeah, it's just again the thought came up like terraforming for who, and terraforming what? Does partial terraforming exist? Can it be that we just by as Sean was talking, this satellites, I get this image of this slime mold that is progressing like this wave, and then it finds food, and then it creates this tendril that is connected to the food, and then it disperses of the rest because it found something, and then you get this sort of three-dimensional organism indeed that's reaching, but it's still potentially dependent on the center because Earth is the origin. But what happens if a tendril gets cut off and it is self-perpetuating, but maybe self-perpetuating over typically millions, hundreds of millions, or thousands of millions of years? And then I'm thinking, has the planet done terraforming before? Was potentially like let's say the meteorites striking the Earth at the end of the dinosaur era, that also potentially ejected a large amount of Earth material into the cosmos. Well, you have bacterial and fungal spores that are able to survive in outer space for we don't know how long. And maybe that is ejected out of our solar system. So is that already an act of seeding or trying to seed other worlds? And then indeed, how centered is the Earth? How centered is the human in this kind of discussion? And of course, in the discussion we're having, is the Earth enough for us? And then it's like, yeah, for us, how we currently are, or how we currently think. What are the main programs running the human superorganism? And clearly, indeed, like Sean and Cadell already pointed out, like for that program, probably not. But yeah.
I think that if you look at even childhood fantasies, or maybe even especially childhood fantasies, humans are not even enough for ourselves. Like there's a fundamental asymmetry at the heart of the human itself, which is perhaps one of the drives or the motors of the human, that we have this insatiability, we have this reaching, we have this expanding for more, for more, for more. And I'm not trying here to say that the limit of our thinking is this spurious infinity without end. But it seems to be built into us from childhood. It might have to do with the way we appear as children. I think that's something that we often overlook when we think too much from an evolutionary perspective. When we think too much from an evolutionary perspective, we think about the evolution of the cosmos before we appeared, but we neglect to think about the way we appear here. Like the way we appear here, I think strongly structures a lot of the fantasies we have of wanting more and wanting to be more than we are, because we appear in such a impotent condition. But in regards to this, the earth enough, maybe this is relevant. Osho had this great reflection on Van Gogh about the way Van Gogh painted trees reaching for the stars, because he saw an inherent reaching in the trees themselves for the stars, even if, of course, trees can't reach the stars literally. And I think that we see that same proclivity in the human being if you look at science fiction. Science fiction is in many ways just our fantasies, but they're fantasies that show a reaching, and now whether that reaching is again to be transformed into the actual, I think is a separate question, but it certainly shows a desire inside of us for something that's mysterious and for something that we don't really know how to make sense of. But the idea that's come up and been expressed, I think, by Simon, Layman expressed it, I think, very clearly, and I think Sean showed some sympathy to it, which is this metaphor of the anchoring and the flowering, which I think is quite, and if we're going to approach this question of the anchoring and the flowering, I think that also brings us to this question that I think Simon expressed as inspired by the biological metaphor of the organ and the body in regards to the individual and the society, or the individual and the human species as such. And I think that on the anchoring side of things, we're having a huge problem with anchoring the human species in regards to family construction, family building, which I think is kind of the ground zero of reproducing the species, let's say. And then in regards to the flowering side of things, I think we have this huge crisis of the state, precisely because capitalism so absolutely transcends it. So the anchoring issue, and these are probably connected. So the anchoring, the family, the flowering, right now, kind of, we don't have a supranational containment function for what seems to be a process which is expanding at the expense of the we, or at the expense of any meaningful sense of the we, where the we becomes a very, there was this ridiculous Netflix documentary that was just put online by Bill Gates, which is basically the self-promotion documentary for himself. And he's sitting there with Bernie Sanders in one interview where Bernie Sanders is doing what Bernie Sanders does. And Bill Gates is, just confronting this intractable issue and not knowing what to do about it. But I think that these are the levels in which we have the problem of the anchoring and the flowering.
That's great. Can I drop in a brief thought? What kind of flower are we turning into? Is it a dandelion? That sort of the seeds are dispersed and go everywhere in the wind, but that leaves, after a flower has blossomed, what is the earth a blossoming tree, or is the human species a tree, or are we an annual kind of thing?
I think you see our flowering in our dance. You see our flowering in our music. You see our flowering in our humor. You see our flowering in our intellect. You see our flowering in all of the different creative, spiritual expressions of the human being, which I think naturally unfold given the right starting conditions and given the right process of containment for our development. Whereas if we don't have a good starting condition, if we don't have a good anchoring, it can get really, really dark. And so basically the flower doesn't bloom.
I'd love to return to your question, Simon. That's where I like to hang out most, is wondering what the flower is. But if I can introduce something either for now or to return to that occurred to me in the last few minutes, in terms of the anchoring, and that is, it really, I'm convinced that the question of anchoring is fundamentally different for individuals who experience themselves as males versus those who experience themselves as females. I mean, if you look at, so we identified capitalism, but there's also, patriarchy, and by patriarchy I mean the collective experience of those who experience themselves as males. I mean, it's the ones waging war, the ones committing most of the violence, the ones sitting on most of the boards, the CEOs, the nation, the governing bodies of the nation states that are trashing the planet. They're 90% men. And I don't think that's an accident. Men. I was really impressed by the research of some feminists like Nancy Chodorow and Mary O'Brien and others who point out the obvious that women, by virtue of their bodies and their biological potential, immediately experience themselves as included within the circle of life, whereas men don't, men, as they awaken to themselves as men, they realize, oh my God, I'm not a woman. I'm not my mother. I don't give birth. I can't give birth. It's an old thought, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that the male identified psyche is plagued by a fundamental existential anxiety relative to embodiedness, to the wider circle of life, that is so overcompensated by this a certain kind of reaching and domination and power over and rapacious consumption and so on. So I think it's important to identify that. And here we are. We're four white males. I think we're probably, I would like to think, we're atypical in many respects, in that we've, for whatever reason, we've tried to become aware of and transform the problematic manifestations of our masculinity, of our maleness, I should say. But the world is it's still so fucking dominated by stupid, angry, unconsciously fearful men. And unless that is somehow dealt with, I'm not, I'm very pessimistic. Look at Musk, Musk. I don't want to single out individuals, but Musk, Trump. I mean, all of these. I mean, Gates, God love him, his face in front of Bernie is just. I've actually felt some sympathy for poor Bill. He doesn't have a clue. He just does not have a clue.
Yeah, that's rings very true for me emotionally and ethically. I think orienting towards increased health and sensitivity and undoing trauma and bringing masculine and feminine and all these things back into better kinds of balance. That's all upstream of determining whether the organ that the human being is in the biosphere will do a reasonable or an unreasonable, a good or a bad version of its potential task, I think. When I think about gender, though, it's interesting. I think it looks to me like life on Earth generates complementary dualities in order to get its job done in a very interesting way. Left brain and right brain modes, and conservative and liberal social tendencies, male and female bodies that had to be kind of invented by life over a long period of time. So there's pathological and useful versions of that, and that same separative anxiety in the males is also, I think, when it smooths out or becomes healthier or gets the things that it needs rather than acting on all these compensatory drives, has a really important role to play in and for the rest of the system, which looks like the a special role in the flowering aspect, I think. I don't think space migration is the privileged form of the flowering. I think it's one of the aspects. But when I try to think what is the biosphere for and how do we help it, my notion of helping comes in kind of three ways. One is sort of technological, like James Lovelock's book on the Nova scene. The guy who named Gaia thinks the AIs are kind of the actual inhabitants of the noosphere in a sense. And I think that's really important to look at because that is happening. And we have to do a job of creating those in a way that's consonant with well-being and thriving for humans of all kinds and ecosystems. So there is a technological aspect to it. I think there's an ethos transformation element to this that I look at. My concept is sacred naturalism of some kind. We're like a naturalizing of the sacred and a sacralizing of the natural as the way of generally thinking about how we create a cultural transformation at all levels in all domains that could bring forth general thriving. And then the subset of that, and probably one of the reasons I'm here is because Tim and I have had so many conversations around a shamanic revival. And I think there are differences in the degree to which individuals are moved by that science fiction drive for mystery that Cadell was talking about, right? That some people within the village, so to speak, have always been more even obsessively attuned to changes of state, to mediating between the village and the wilderness, to deeper grounding and indigenizing of people through cultural ritual, but also expanding and moving into strangeness as culture ritual. And I think there's a need, from my point of view, to regenerate a rich and matured and healthy and socially valued kind of cast of people who can oversee the tending of the garden in both its anchoring and flowering functions.
Beautiful. You're reminding me of M.H. Abrams' book, Natural Supernaturalism, right? You're in good company there.
Yeah, lovely. No, that resonates very deeply for me, and also with sort of my personal interest. What I'm then thinking about, also coming back to the expression of the masculine in specifically the human male, and if we look at these as natural energy flows or sort of maybe underlying structures that shape nature, then we can think of like, okay, is this organ that is being shaped? If we use the brain example, for instance, is it predominantly left hemispherical versus right hemispherical? How's the balance within the human organ, and is that the thing that we're figuring out? Is it about rebalancing? Is it about grounding this maleness or the propensity of the masculine energy to reach? But to reach potentially by forgetting the roots, by forgetting the soil from which it's growing, which is tended to by the feminine, I think, or I feel. Then shamanism maybe plays a role in that. Like cultural shamanism is like, okay, what are the expressions? What are the gene expressions within the organism? How is it diversifying? How do we do epigenetics? How do we work with the different expressions that are on different places within the organ? How does it start to shape? How does it gain shape? How do we call in the blueprint or the morphogenetic field of this organ, one that is life affirming for the rest? Does that exist already? Is that a thing that we have to tune in, or is that being generated as we speak? Some thoughts.
I just want to say quickly that there is a cultural tendency towards denigrating and pathologizing the masculine, which I think is a framing issue. And I think that cultural tide is already changing, so I don't need to say too much more about that. But there is a deep challenge here that comes up because of the asymmetry between men and women that I don't know if we know how to discuss. My hypothesis is that in the way that Sean was saying that feminist literature will point towards the woman's body naturally predisposing her to be conceiving of herself as within the circle of life, I think that men are closer to death naturally. And I think that that raises an interesting ethical question for men of what do you do with that closeness to death? What do you do with that lack of biological bodily anchoring that women more naturally have, although we should not, against sort of a more bio-focused feminism, not essentialize that for women either, because there are many women who do choose not to biologically reproduce, and in that sense, I think they lose a certain anchoring that women who choose to have children naturally confront. In other words, women naturally confront death within life through giving birth to the child, because that is kind of a death process as well. The woman dies to the child and becomes decentered to the child. And that's, I think, pretty fundamental. So the question comes, if a man who's exceptionally talented does not undergo a decentering process, that man in a certain system could become the type of pathological entity I think that Sean's pointing towards. And so, I think that that's another reason why there's a renewed interest in Christianity, because I think that men are finding in Christianity the symbol of Christ, which is a kind of meditation on one's death. And not only a meditation on one's death that ends in death, but a meditation on one's death that ends in rebirth towards something like an immortal drive, something that keeps going after death. And I think that is potentially very healthy for men to confront and internalize. And of course, there might be other, let's say, spiritual psychotechnologies or metaphors that men can use to encounter that and to counteract the type of behavior that we might see in for example, the work of someone like Andrew Tate, who is showing to men en masse basically the fantasy world of what any 15-year-old would think is the best possible life. Having 10 cars and mansions and flying around the world with different women and stuff like that. And so that's, I think, an expression of a man who probably hasn't yet confronted that death function that one needs to confront in order for one's drive to be of service. So I think, that's how do we do that without viewing men as inherently pathological or problematic? Because men at their best are also, they bring a lot of beauty to the world and are beautiful. And so how to speak to that? I'll just say before closing that in one of the things that I think I've learned through the work at Philosophy Portal is that a lot of 20-year-old guys come to Philosophy Portal, 20 something, who don't find a place in the university, who are smart, who just want to learn for learning's sake. And I think a lot of people would confront these guys and see them as a little bit raw, a little bit wild, and in need of some maturation, in need of some work. But I think that is part of what we need. We've really had in the breakdown of family and community, we've had the breakdown of the intergenerational links, which can help men model themselves and raise themselves to the level of an adult that we would see as an ideal expression of masculinity in this world. And I think a lot of men are struggling with that. Like, they're in the void. They don't have, a lot of them are fatherless. And so that drive can become, of course, pathological.
Mm-hmm. It's rich. If I can just be clear, I don't believe that masculinity is or all males are intrinsically and necessarily pathological. And I also believe that patriarchy and capitalism, as destructive as they have been and continue to be, have played an essential role in the actualization of Earth's deepest longing. This is my belief, and I say as much in both of my books, Coming Home and Becoming Gaia, that if one of the goals of Earth or Gaia was to awaken to herself as Gaia, It's my conviction that that could not have happened without capitalism and patriarchy, for the reasons that you point to, Cadell, that there's a differentiating function, perhaps in my terms, Hegelian, Jungian terms, the kind of differentiating, actualizing function of the masculine that led through colonial conquest, through exploration, through the conflict of internecine struggle, led to the emergence of a planetary community. And I don't think that would have happened without it. Humans would have been perfectly fine living in their bioregional, local clans and communities and so on. It wouldn't have become planetary without that overreaching drive of both patriarchy and capitalism. So I'm willing to grant that and see that, okay, there's both an intrinsic virtue of the masculine, as well as there has been an essential function, developmental function. And now that we are on this threshold of the planet Gaia waking up to herself as a planet, just at that point where it's the very conditions that have led to the possibility of that emergence are on the verge of collapse, then the question becomes, well, what happens? And I think you're all answering it in your own way. I mean, what needs to happen to the masculine now? Shamanic revival, a reconsideration of roles within the family, and so on and so forth, male initiation, all of these questions come up. Yeah, so just wanted to add that.
Beautiful. I can be just really brief. It's again touching upon the role of death, the role that death plays in this whole process. And I think indeed you mentioned now initiation is often the death of the child and the birth of the adult. And potentially it's if we focus on males, it's the death of the boy and the birth of the man. We can also look at our systems as being sort of pathologically undeath, like being almost the thing that is active as a sort of zombie that is sort of close to dying, but it's holding on. And maybe that's also part in this sort of more pathological expressions of masculinity, where it's a sort of a youth that has to die, let's say, in order to grow up and become, the adult. Yeah.
As Cadell knows, because we talked about this the other day, I'm just coming back from leading the metamodern spirituality retreat around the goddess and the divine feminine. So I've been steeped in the complexities of the gender issues to the point where I almost feel like they're too rich to even begin talking about. I worry it would hijack the rest of the discussion to some degree. But one of the things that came up a lot for people there was this sense that the reviving and upgrading of the feminine is something that occurs within men and women, and that the standing forth with and appreciating masculine feelings and tendencies is to some degree, the feminism within the men, the recovery of the feminine and the upgrading of the feminine as the form of men appreciating their own feelings as being valid and not being invalid relative to sort of female emotional patterns that might be more nature centric, might be more interpersonal in nature, these sorts of things. So it's a very complex area. But I really liked Simon's double clicking on death. Death is something I think we're not good at in two ways. Like, we're not good at accepting death, but we're also not good at fighting death. Like, we need to be able to die, and we need to be able to try to live much more than any of us are good at. We don't get a lot of cultural reinforcement for either of those. I think the subconscious plays a big role here, right? When I try to think out who are these, the shamanoid sub percentage of the population, one of their distinguishing characteristics tend to be a more than normal involvement with subconscious intelligence. And there's different ways to break down the brain, not just left and right, but there's this tendency of the left brain to confront technical details that are well established through social information. And social information from any given time period of history is a little bit limited. If the biosphere is trying to do something through us, if we're an organ, we would have to seek the understanding of how to perform that organ function in something that isn't dependent on where and when you were born. something that's available to any human being, regardless of where and when it was born. So something that's in the non-social or pre-social subconscious layer of our intelligence that holds psychoanalytic structures, that holds the seeds that can become our virtue experience, that holds the way we encounter death, holds a lot of those different things in there. And that the people who gain expertise in that area need to be able to help other people in society confront and go through those things, so that the shamans or the witches or the organic priests or whatever we want to think of these people as, we need to set up a social system in which they can present that mystery to everyone else, so that they can show both the patriarchs and the matriarchs that there is a power that exceeds their power, exceeds their biological social realities. And one of the things the shamans used to be able to do in relatively healthy cultural situations was periodically there was a ritual where the Elon Musk or the Bill Gates or the Gaddafi or whoever it was subordinated to another range of mysteries who were regarded as more important than the social structure of the tribe, but which most people in the tribe did not encounter on a regular basis. But this need to set up ritual apparatuses whereby people who have an extraordinary ability or an extraordinary status are still brought to confront death, brought to confront the humility of their epistemological position, or brought to confront the fact that they are not the superordinate position in the universe of meaning. Right? We need to have rituals and ritual experts that do that for us. And I would imagine that those are the people who are much more versed than others in accessing the subconscious or pre-social roots of special forms of meaning making that only emerge into consciousness if you work with them for a long time.
I can speak to or try to articulate something in the direction of what Layman's articulating with precisely the shamanic dimension as this sort of dimension of a mystery which subordinates powerful individuals. I don't know if it's going to problematize or expand the concept of the shamanic or its potential utility, but I think that in the same way that, say, boys need to grow up and become men, I think that the older generation is also constipated. And this older generation being constipated, I think, is blocking the flows of the human body in a deep way. And so the question is, how do we unblock this constipation? How do we move from a constipated state to a more of a letting state? And here I'm talking specifically about people with outsized power, wealth, and resources. I think that the idea I'm working with is a kind of inversion between the way I think our society thinks about impossibility and immortality. I'll try to bring this into a very relatable example, but I can actually reference someone that probably all of you know in some way. But I just listened to a podcast with Bobby Azarian, who wrote The Romance of Reality. And he's working on a book where he is developing the idea that he thinks the first generation of people that will become immortal are alive now. And I think this is precisely the wrong way to think about the relationship between impossibility and immortality. And say that
what does he mean? Sorry, what does he
way.
mean by immortal? Sorry, can you tell me what does he mean by immortal?
What he means by immortal is that he thinks that we're learning so much about the human body, our health, and our capacities that in some sense, I would use the word that comes up in transhumanist literature a lot. You reach longevity escape velocity, where the longer you live, the more life you have left to live, as opposed to the longer you live, the less life you have left to live. I'm using that as an example to contradict this way of thinking, because I think it's an example of the wrong way to think about the relationship between impossibility and immortality. So I think a lot of people in our generation, consciously or unconsciously, think we need to remove impossibility to reach immortality. What that means is they think that there's some impossible hurdle, like the death of the body, that needs to be removed, overcome, transcended in order to become immortal. But I think this is a childish way to think about the relationship between impossibility and immortality. I think we need to accept and integrate impossibility in order to reach immortality, but it's not an immortality of us as individual spirits. It's not an immortality of Sean, Layman, and Cadell and Simon. It's an invitation to participate in what could potentially be, let's say, the immortality of the spirit that just keeps going on through us as individuals. And perhaps that's what Layman's project of the shamanic and saying the shamanic is this space of a magical sort of leveling of a space where people who have too much power or authority, it's kind of the expression, the way and I'd like Layman to correct me if I'm wrong on this, the shamanic is a kind of non-democratic space, you know, and it has a certain weird power to it. Now, my sort of question, critique, expansion of the idea of the shamanic is that from my point of view, this leveling has to happen on the level of a supranational entity. The problem is that we don't have supranational entities. We don't have supranational coordination capacities, and capitalism does. And so what you see in the aforementioned Netflix documentary with Bill Gates is that even the well-intentioned billionaire is trying to get billionaires to basically self-regulate themselves and give away their resources. But even then, that sort of is more of a symptom of the problem than a solution of the problem. So how could we think of, that's I guess my question is, how could we think of something analogous to what Layman's saying with the shamanic on the level of supranational coordination? And I just want to say here to sort of tie it all together, that this is an expression of an impossibility that we have to accept and confront. And here I'm referencing specifically the work of Thomas Piketty in Capitalism in the 21st Century, where Thomas Piketty proposes a global wealth tax. But the response to Thomas Piketty's project is they say that's impossible. How could you ever implement a global wealth tax? So we're averse to thinking through impossibilities, but actually it's thinking through these impossibilities that might open a new way to think, again, the immortality, but immortality as our spiritual self-othering process.
Can I add just an image that came up at the end as you were speaking? So we're approaching an impossibility. I'm getting the image of a bird embryo in an egg. So it's approaching the impossibility of a shell, the impossibility of escaping its containment, but its containment which it sees its resources in dwindling and its pollution in increasing. And so what is, when is it striving through the impossibility? Yeah.
I mean, what Sean was calling late stage capitalism does present us with a whole suite of impossibilities.
Yeah, I mean, on the ideal side, there's already been the statement of what a kind of guiding ideal with the Earth Charter. Are you familiar with the Earth Charter? If not, please look at it because it's a very precious document. It is it's an articulation that people from, I can't remember how many nation states participated in drafting by the UN, and it is basically a blueprint for a planetary constitution that would, if to the extent that nation states or other groups based their own constitutions on it, would provide a way of moving in the direction that you're talking about, Cadell, and Layman and Simon. I mean, all of us really. Of course, it's non-binding at this point, as everything in the UN is, and as long as the UN is of course dominated by the Security Council, that's sort of where we're at. But on the other hand, there's nothing other than the UN. The UN is the only thing we have at this point. But the Earth Charter is more than the UN. It's actually an articulation at the level of the ideal of would need to happen? What could guide us in moving forward? There's also the ideal of ecological civilization, which is explicitly affirmed in China right now, and the minister, the secretary for the environment, Mr. Xie. I just watched a conversation with him, and for the Chinese, of course, ecological civilization is still embedded within the idea of sustainable development, right? So it's still, in a sense, embedded within industrial growth society. But there are these ideals. A dear friend of mine, Jeremy Lent, is working on his next book on ecological civilization, which many people are trying to articulate this idea. If we call it the Great Turning, ecological civilization, there are different names for it, but there are various individuals and human communities that are groping for an articulation of this planetary ideal that is there would be a kind of ethical standard to guide us. So I think it's already been achieved in one sense at the level of idea, but whether what is required in order to move towards greater actualization, that's really the question. Like what would need to happen? Okay, yes, if we could get together, if we could have synergy between these shamanic and neo-shamanic individuals, and or more communication between Gnostic communities, as Aurobindo would say, yes, we need that. I agree. And I wonder if we don't have something fairly dramatic at the political level in terms of resistance and revolutionary action. I just can't see an alternative to accelerating collapse. And maybe the planetary, maybe the awareness of the noospheric, the carriers of the noosphere will exist in isolated individuals, isolated communities, but there won't be the same kind of exchange of matter energy on a planetary scale as we have now. So the anthroposphere will degrade along with the rest of the biosphere. What form planetary consciousness will take after that collapse, and whether there's some kind of regeneration possible on the other side of collapse, I don't know. But if we're to slow down the collapse and even preserve a chance, as slim as it seems, of actualizing something like an ecological civilization or the ideals of the Earth Charter, I think we need to consider pretty radical revolutionary action at this point.
Three things are coming up for me, listening particularly to Sean and Cadell's last comments. The first one, and I think Tim hinted at this in some of his prompting, is a question about ecological economics and how that plays a role in ecological civilization. It's not a solution to everything, but there have been a lot of people doing a lot of work thinking about how we take the quantities of ecology into account so that the invisible hand doesn't treat them as non-existent in its enacted computations of how people are going to behave, right? That the simplistic example is always that if a tree is doing $1,000 worth of work standing in the forest and you cut it down and sell it for $800, you've lost $200, so you don't do that. If you count it as doing zero work in the forest and you sell it for $800, then you're up $800 on the deal. So whether or not quantities from these domains are included in our calculus makes an enormous difference, especially, I would say, in the mid-range, before we can rethink the entire set of underpinnings of our economics. To me, that's a subset of what I call sacred naturalism, which is largely the attempt to repattern anthropotechnical domains in the form of organic and complex ecological domains. And there's lots of different ways to do that. And I think every way in which we do that can potentially help, and that they will converge. So that's one of the things I'm thinking is ecological economics. Another one I'm thinking is around the Bobby Azarian question, because I know and I like Bobby, and he can be a bit of a techno-optimist at times. And his attempt to create overlaps between his understanding of the big ideas in traditional religion and a scientific story about the awakening of the cosmos. There's a lot of good work in that, but to Sean's earlier point about UAPs, and I just came a couple of months ago from leading a UAP retreat. There's this other element where all the great religions did not start from somebody selling a top-down narrative to people. It started from individuals having strange encounters with beings and phenomenon they couldn't name or depict properly, right? That UAPs in the Jacques Vallée sense are upstream of all the religions and all the cultures. And so this notion of an other to the human and an other to the biosphere, whether we think that as different physical locations with different evolutionary histories, or we think that as non-material ecosystems and bodies in different ways, that's something we may want to delve further into in this conversation. And then the third thing I was thinking is I just came from a conference with Joe Brewer about the Greater Toronto Bioregion. And Joe Brewer's sense is a really interesting one, that we already have these frameworks for an ecological transformation that are widely embraced by the non-governmental bodies that are working with them. But that's not changing things. In order to change things, you have to change the organization of the landscape and of the resources. And upstream of that is a shift in generating stories and networks and social relationships around bioregions. So we were there to try to help set up the Greater Toronto bioregion and set up these bioregions in other areas of the world and have them be allies to each other so that we can tell bioregional stories, bring communities together around bioregions, and that brings money together around bioregions, which starts to change the way the social and legislative framework and business gets done. And if you can build up from the bottom with bioregions as the basic chunks of social organization, then maybe you can start to move the whole system toward an ecologically resonant form. So those are the three things that are on my mind.
It's great.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm tired of the guys with it seems to be this mix of the guy with the big they're non-religious guys who have big cosmic visions and are developing a religion without knowing they're developing a religion. And trying to think that this grand narrative is going to that this grand narrative is going to solve something, or that this passes for thinking. Like it's not thinking. It's not
to
thinking.
put too fine a point on it.
But but it's so common, and it's never called out. It's never called out. And it's like the biggest mask for it's the biggest mask for thinking. But it's actually the opposite of it. And it is, I think, ultimately coming from people who are either outside of religion, have never identified with religion, and are kind of coming into touch with some religious function unconsciously and expressing it as some sort of savior device, some narrativistic savior device. And I think this is, I don't know. I mean, I just for whatever reason, I have my pet peeve with this issue. But I wanted to address what Sean was saying. I think this is a really important point. He said that this issue of the international coordination with the UN, he said, it's solved on the level of the ideal. Right? And this is actually the reason why I call myself a materialist. Because like I know like materialism gets a bad rap, but materialism in terms of like this, the difference between having a bright idea and actualizing the idea. You know, I think this gap is where the interesting thinking comes in. And I think I don't need to say too much, but like, and also I think Sean brought up this issue of the ethical standard, you know, is what's at stake. And like for me, the way I'm thinking about it is like this ethical standard versus the reality of these endless flows and mobility of enjoyment and capital. You know, and I think this is where liberal democracies brought us. Like liberal democracy has brought us the liberation of individual flows. But we seem to be reaching an impasse to think beyond liberal democracy. There's a friend I have who's also going to be presenting at the Philosophy of Right conference next week, who's writing a book called Liberal Democracy as Totalitarianism. it's a very strange form of totalitarianism because it presents itself as the inverse. It presents itself as the opposite of totalitarianism. But actually, to question any model outside of liberal democracy is actually very difficult. And I think the impasse that I've experienced trying to think it and the symptoms I see when I observe people trying to think outside of it is we try to think for some sort of non-democratic collectivist form, but it's hard to think of a non-democratic collectivist form which isn't a regression to liberal democracy, right? It's hard to think liberal democracy to a non-democratic collectivist form that isn't a regression, right? So I don't know. This is to me the impasse, and then how to think about this translation of something that in the ideal, okay, we've kind of solved, but how to translate that into action.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm a Marxist of one kind or another too. I mean, I'm many things. I'm an idealist. I'm a Christian. I'm a Buddhist. But yeah. But I agree that actually my wife is now studying with Kohei Saito. Do you know Kohei Saito? His various books are Marx and the Anthropocene. He's at Tokyo University of Tokyo, and his whole thing is degrowth communism. And he's the editor of Marx's ecological notebooks and the collected works of Karl Marx. It's anyway, it's a whole thing about interpreting the later Marx in relation to ecology. But yeah, I'm totally with you there. Yes, it's all solved in the ideal. The question is, as Marx said, until now, philosophers have only thought about the world, but the point is to change it, right? So which is the question? Well, what do we do? What strategy do we have? And I appreciate what you're saying, Layman, about working at the level of bioregions and also, Cadell, if I'm hearing you properly, working at the level of interpersonal relations and the family. And so, yeah, I mean, we're in a bind, what to do. And since I imagine we're sort of nearing our end, if I can just say my sort of like where I've come to in these larger questions is that on the one hand, and this is what I like to believe about my own life, if I were to die, very soon, I would like to believe that at the moment of death, I would say, okay, it is finished. Like Jesus' last words on the cross. It's complete, and that I could bless it, that it's mission accomplished sort of thing, right? And I would like to believe, and I do believe, that between now and that moment, whenever it should arise, there is more to be done. And that what can be done, as small as it is, has, in a sense, infinite value, intrinsic value. I mean, for every occasion that I can reduce suffering, for every moment that I can bless rather than curse, I really believe that these moments live eternally. They're not just passing moments. They, whether or not you believe in Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, or my interpretation of that as the eternally occurring, which I've tried to articulate in my monograph on time and the soul, that on the one hand, yes, Earth is enough, my life is enough, it's all enough, it's all good. And for the time remaining, there is so much that can be done, that needs to be done, regardless of the outcome, regardless of whether or not the asteroid hits or it all just collapses. It doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter. What matters is what is there still to do, and what is being called for to be done. If I think of all the people hungry, of all the women who aren't allowed to speak in public, for all the women being abused, for all the men being abused, for all the people in hospitals and prisons, for all of the things that can be done and need to be done, then Earth is not yet satisfied. There's still longing that is being expressed, that wants to be satisfied through us. So those are my two sides, and sort of my seemingly incompatible, paradoxical sides.
I think that I'll just say, is the Earth enough? I'll just say no. Like and the reason why I say no is because I kind of think about it as like for me personally, I think about it as like an indifferent contingent background, and that what really matters to us, what is enough for us? Like what is enough for us? To me, it always brings us to these questions about the self and society, about the human social process, about how I participate in this human social process, whether or not I can look myself in the mirror, whether I can tolerate myself in terms of like the things Sean's bringing to our attention, in terms of thinking about myself in relationship to the moment of my death. What will that be like? Can I forgive the atrocities? Can I forgive my failures? Can I forgive the other? All of these things seem to be what's at stake when we reach that moment of dying well or something like that. And at least for me, my favorite Instagram account is called, it's not my favorite, it's one of my favorite Instagram accounts. It's called The Dark Side of Nature. And it's just these videos of like the most horrific things that happen in nature. And like there's some like really friggin' horrific things that happen in nature. And I'm just saying, like, the reason why I pay attention to that is because like I don't think like, look, of course nature is beautiful. And of course we can enjoy hiking in the mountains or seeing a beautiful waterfall or going camping or and so forth and so on. But I think we created civilization for a reason. And we created civilization because it was preferable in some sense. Like it was preferable to be in here than out there. And so to me the question is, how can we make civilization something that, I don't know if sustainable is the right word, but how can we make civilization something that accommodates a new level of the human species? And I think we should always remember when we think through this problem, how new that problem is, right? Like, because it's at most, like really, if we're thinking about accommodating a global way of thinking about the human species, a new spheric conception. Like we're talking less than 100 years old, because Teilhard de Chardin's idea of the new sphere is less than 100 years old still. So to really think in a new spheric way, and there are more and more people thinking in a new spheric way, and there are more and more people trying to bring that consciousness online, that reflection online. The question is if that can really trickle through our networks towards the level of the fundamental way in which society is structured, which is sort of set up and structured in such a way that certainly creates these insane asymmetries. I'll leave with kind of like this question that like someone like Jordan Peterson always brings up, actually, is this question of like that these insane asymmetries have always been there. That nature and human history is just always full of these insane asymmetries. That ancient Egypt had these insane asymmetries. That ancient China, you know, all empires were built on slavery. So there have been these huge human structural injustices. I mean, I guess that's kind of like the big challenge again when you're brought to death and when you're brought to forgiveness, is like when you're brought to death and forgiveness, to me, you're brought to these. How can I forgive the injustices of this world? That's just these injustices of the world, and it's you know, I'm definitely still stayed. I haven't completely let go. Like I cling to my, like I cling to the injustices I feel like either I've experienced or that I feel society is. It's hard for me to really let go of that. So, you know, that's but I think it's at that level that we reach the question, is it enough?
Simon, do you want to go next or do you want to go last in terms of framing this?
Doesn't matter to me. What feels good.
All right, I'll say a couple of things. My mind distinguishes between natural and nature. I feel like nature is incalculably complex and contradictory and ambivalent about our well-being and her own well-being. I think the natural is a kind of creative synergizing between the anthropotechnological and the complex ecological patterning styles, and that nature and the part of nature that nature sets apart through us has to work together to optimize for something that strikes us as being natural somehow. And that's not just the preservation of what we inherit, it's a constructive affair going forward, that we can make new naturalness, and we can do that in a very rich, very deep, multidimensional way. But we're not necessarily doing that at this time with the cultures that we have. From this conversation, I feel like the flowering and anchoring framing is one that's going to linger with me. I think what I've expressed here around a shamanically tended trans-noospheric metabiosphere with interior and exterior functions for humans as organs and ecosystems, that's a lovely story, and I hope stories like that will spread. I see real value in telling stories like that if our own moral, interpersonal, and psychological transformation is explained as implicitly part of what serves that ecosystemic self-regulation and self-transformation. But the element of death has haunted this whole conversation, and it's a beautiful thing, death in its own way, because we will fail and we are unworthy. And that can be a cause of rejoicing. It's the condition of all the lives of all the beings who have gone before us. And each individual and the collective will somehow perish at some point. And taking that fragility and that finitude into account when we try to be helpful and move things forward and improve things, I think is essential, both in the subtle and in the concrete. There's a line from Bo Burnham's Inside, in one of the songs, where he says, 20,000 years of this, 7 more to go. It just broke my heart when I heard it. But I feel like that kind of heartbreak is essential to do good work in a post-tragic sense, both post-tragic in terms of shared destabilization, but in terms of our own endlessly imminent demise. I've been very happy to get to know Simon a little bit, and I hope we have some more chances to exchange. Cadell, we recently talked about doing more work together. And Sean, blessings on your imminent death. May your heart give you the worthy death that you need. But in the meantime, I hope we can get a lot more good work out of you. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Sweet. Yeah. Likewise.
Lovely.
Yeah, a lot of words have, in these closing remarks, a lot of things that will stay with me as well in this conversation that we've had. One that is coming up for me is excitement about the question, is the Earth enough? Because I think we haven't even begun to become conscious of what richness the Earth carries. And then that can be a material richness, and we've been trying to gather quite a bit of that, also in a deleterious way, in a lot of deleterious ways. But the richness in the depth of the interior of the planet, of these deep flows. So we have what I feel is the ideal, which we talked about, like the blueprints are there for an ecological society, but it's not in the body. It's not in the body of the human, and not in the body of Gaia yet. That's how it feels. And then it feels to me like, okay, are we going to be, again, as slime molds, or as these kind of swarm organisms, are we going to start reaching out, looking for where are good nutrients? And once we attach to those, are we going to digest them and bring them into the body, into the social body of the human? And in what ways is this metabolism going to change our behavior? And the excitement comes really to both the exploration of where are the good metabolites, but also the process of how do we do this digestion, and what does that look like? And then is that storytelling as well? It's like, once you digest it and embody it, is it how you disperse this to your fellow organ cells around you, and how does that change their composition? And that seems like fun to me. So in that sense, I think maybe for now the Earth is enough. I don't know yet how further down it will go. So with that, yeah, thank you all very much, Cadell, Sean, Layman. I've appreciated all of your work in the past, and it's been great sharing this conversation with you, and looking forward to more interactions in the future.
Yeah, same here. Be well. It's been a real gift.
Thanks so much. Great to meet you, Sean, for the first time, and always great to be with you, Simon and Layman.
Likewise. Yeah, I hope we have the chance to reconvene. Very, very rich.
Tell Tim we need a part 2.